Have you ever wondered why a completely random collection of grammatically perfect sentences can leave you totally baffled, while a single, isolated word shouted across a crowded room, like, stop, makes perfect, instantaneous sense? It's kind of a fascinating paradox, isn't it? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to take some pretty complex linguistic theory and transform it into a highly structured no-nonsense study guide. We're zeroing in on the 7 principles of textuality and comparing expository and procedural text structures, all to help you absolutely master the architecture of communication for your exam. Here's our quick roadmap for today. First, an intro to discourse analysis. Second, the 7 principles of textuality. Third, analyzing expository texts. Fourth, analyzing procedural texts. And finally, we'll put expository and procedural texts head to head. All right, section 1, intro to discourse analysis, the paradigm shift. Let's jump in. So, for the longest time, the focus in linguistics was stricting on isolated grammar rules. Think of this as text analysis. It just looks at the internal structure, the literal nuts and bolts or linguistic traits of the text itself. But discourse analysis, that represents a massive, holistic paradigm shift. This approach actually cares about how language is deployed in real-world communicative contexts. It's asking how specific, deliberate choices, like a sudden shift in verb tense or throwing in a very specific pronoun, actually affect the entire architecture of communication between real human beings. But hey, before we can analyze a text, we gotta define what a text actually is, right? And this is absolutely vital for your exam. A text is fundamentally defined as a passage, either spoken or written, that forms a unified communicative whole. And here's the kicker. Scale is completely irrelevant. A text isn't just some dense 10-page academic essay. It can be a massive monologue, for sure, but it can also be a single phrase or literally just one word on a street sign. As long as it functions as a complete communicative unit, it's a text. Moving right along to section 2, 7 principles of textuality, the Bogrand and Dressler framework. To make this super easy to remember for your exam, we are going to chunk this information. To be considered genuinely communicative, a text has to pass 7 tests, or standards. The best way to memorize these is to split them into 2 friendly buckets. First up, we've got the 2 internal standards, cohesion and coherence. These are basically the internal rules holding the words and ideas together. Second, we have 5 contextual standards. These are the external rules that connect those words to the actual real world, the speaker and the listener. Let's look at that very first internal standard, cohesion. Think of this as your literal linguistic toolkit. Cohesion is the grammatical and lexical glue that binds the surface of the text together, and it leans on 4 main mechanisms. There's reference, which is using pronouns to point backward or forward. There's substitution and ellipsis, where we swap out or just completely drop words because the reader can intuitively fill in the blanks. Lexical cohesion is all about strategically using synonyms, like saying feline a sentence after you said cat, so you don't sound incredibly repetitive. And finally, conjunction, using logical connectors to bridge your sentences. Now, what about our second internal standard, coherence? Well, if cohesion is the surface-level glue, coherence is the invisible, underlying logical link beneath that surface. It makes sure ideas flow smoothly and actually make conceptual sense together. For example, if I start talking about freezing cold weather, then putting on a heavy winter coat, and then walking the dog, your brain effortlessly connects those 3 concepts. You don't even think about it. That underlying logical flow, that's coherence in action. Okay, let's rapidly hit those 5 contextual standards. These are what ensure a text actually works in the real world. First, intentionality. This is simple. What is the producer's goal? Second, acceptability. This is the receiver's willingness to perceive the text as relevant. It's exactly why using a polite tone usually gets you further. Third, informativity. This is a delicate balancing act of giving the reader new, unexpected information without totally overwhelming what they already know. Fourth is situationality, meaning the text has to make sense in its setting. I mean, a fire escape plan only matters if you're actually inside the building, right? And lastly, intertextuality, which is how much a text depends on prior texts. Think about making a cultural reference or a Shakespeare quote. It totally relies on the reader's background knowledge to land the punch. All right, section 3, analyzing expository texts, structure and function. Let's transition from pure theory into some practical application. It's actually wild how deeply rooted our modern texts are in ancient history. Take expository texts. They're explicitly designed for objective explanation and absolute clarity, and they often mirror 5 classical rhetorical stages. You start with inventio, gathering all your research. Then dispositio, logically arranging that material. Elocutio is picking precise, effective language. Then comes memoria, using chunking or mnemonics to help retain the information, which, fun fact, is exactly what this very explainer is doing for you right now with these clearly structured sections. And finally, actio, the engaging delivery of all that info. Inside that classical structure, expository texts, think like an encyclopedia article, use specific internal developmental patterns to neatly organize all that objective data. They use description to outline physical traits, functions, or processes. They use definition, which can be anything from a punchy single sentence to a complex multi-paragraph breakdown. And they heavily use classification, systematically categorizing information, whether that means explicitly listing out every single member of a group or just doing it partially. Moving to Section 4, Analyzing Procedural Texts, the Architecture of Instruction. So if expository texts are all about objective explanation, procedural texts are all about goal-oriented action, getting stuff done. When you're analyzing a procedural text for your exam, you want to look for its linguistic driving force. The absolute definitive markers here are imperative verbs combined with precise sequencing words. We're talking words like first, then, and next, paired with totally unambiguous commands. If you see that clear, action-driven linguistic pattern, you are looking straight into the heart of procedural language. But keep in mind, procedural texts aren't just a sterile robotic list of steps. Think about assembling a complex piece of furniture or a bicycle. To do it safely, you desperately need crucial non-step elements. You need cautions and warnings so you don't break something or hurt yourself. You need notes for technical specs. You really need reasons so the reader understands exactly why they shouldn't just skip step 4. And you need function descriptions so they actually know what that weirdly shaped metal bracket is supposed to do in the first place. And now, Section 5, Expository versus Procedural Texts, the direct comparison. All right, we've reached the climax of our review. This is the definitive head-to-head comparison, so definitely take a mental snapshot of this for the exam. Let's stack them up systematically. First, purpose. Expository is all about objective explanation, while procedural is goal-oriented instruction. What about structure? Well, expository relies heavily on classical rhetoric, like inventio and dispositio. Procedural leans on sequential steps, heavily supported by those non-step elements, like warnings we just talked about. And language. Expository is descriptive and analytical. Procedural is imperative, driven by precise sequencing. Before we wrap up this explainer, we really need to add a final overarching layer of theory. Think of these as the golden rules of communication. Whether a text is expository, procedural, or literally anything else, to be truly successful, it has to follow regulative principles. Efficiency, meaning getting the point across with minimal effort. Effectiveness, leaving a strong impression. And appropriateness, fitting the actual situation. On top of that, it has to obey Grace's cooperative principle, which boils down to 4 maxims. Quantity, giving just enough info. Quality, telling the truth. Relevance, staying on topic. And manner, being super clear and orderly. Which brings us to our final parting thought. When you truly master textuality, when you deeply understand cohesion, coherence, intentionality, and the totally distinct structures of how we explain versus how we instruct, you realize something pretty profound. Mastering this isn't just about passing a linguistics exam. The very next time you sit down to write a text, ask yourself, are you just casually stringing a few sentences together, or are you actively architecting human behavior and understanding? Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and seriously, good luck with your studies.